everybody. This will be my review of the first episode of the Stand 2020 miniseries. And before we jump into that, I just want to say that Stand is 10 episodes long. And basically right after that I'm going to start WandaVision, right after that I'm going to start Falcon and the Winter Soldier, right after that I'm going to start Loki. So if any of that interests you, subscribe so that when that time comes, you will be notified. And ring the bell if you want to as well. That helps me and it helps you. But yeah, let's jump into the Stand. Before we really get into the review part of it, I just want to have my general thoughts about it. I enjoyed it. The non-linear structure of the narrative is a little bit confusing. Once you get used to it, it's fine, but at first it's a little bit weird. So there are the book can be split up into three main sections. You have the first section is about it focuses largely on the Captain Tripp's plague. And then after the survivors have to either go to Las Vegas or Boulder, Colorado. The second part focuses entirely on Boulder, Colorado and sort of them building their society there, their post-plague society, right? And then the third and final part of the novel focuses on the final confrontation between good versus evil, the final stand, if you will. And so this episode is really interesting because it follows almost exclusively Harold, Lauder, and Stu. We don't meet any of the other characters, only focus on those three main characters. And so we kind of jump back and forth between the first part and the second part. Instead of just going through linearly, we jump through, which I think could potentially, I haven't seen the whole series, but it could potentially hurt the series going forward, because now we know where Fran, Stu, and Harold all end up because we've already seen the future. And so if they run into anything in the present, we're not as invested because we know how they end up. Also, I will say that due to this odd narrative structure, if you are new to the Stand, it's going to be a lot harder to get into the show. But as someone who's seen the original and read the book, I'm very familiar with it. And so as we jump around, I basically know where we are. But if you haven't seen the original or haven't read the book or did one but not the other, maybe you're not as invested and familiar with the story, so it would probably be a little harder to follow along. But this is only the first episode, so I don't know what happens going forward. I don't know how much they skip going forward. I heard that as the series gets later on, they skip less. I don't know if that's true or not, but I hope it is. It's kind of my overall thoughts. The acting is really great. We have Owen Teague, James Marsden, and Odessa Young. Those are the main characters that we have right here playing Stu Redman, Harold Lauder, and Franny Goldsmith. They're all great. I would say that Odessa Young is maybe not as good as Molly Ringwald, although she does have a lot more screen time in this one episode, I think, than Franny did in the entire original miniseries, which is good. So let's just jump into it. I have taken some notes, so we'll just gonna go along. Okay. So I think the intro to the show is really interesting. It has like a Mother Abigail's narration, and she's kind of talking about make your stand. We heard a lot of that in the trailers. And then there's this really interesting title sequence, how it says "the" is obviously THE, and then it changes to STAN, stand. It's really hard to explain, but it's so weird and fascinating. Anyway, so the opening scene is in that second part. It's in part 2. The Boulder Free Zone, okay? And so Harold's job in the Boulder Free Zone is emptying out all the dead bodies from the buildings, and this scene is from a church. It's actually a similar scene we saw in the original miniseries as well. But Harold's one of the people that move the bodies out of the places, and actually, in the novel, he is actually very highly respected among the townspeople, which is kind of ironic because he wants to kill most of them, as we learn later on in this episode. But anyway, we meet Harold Lauder. He's throwing out, there's actually 3 throw-up moments in this episode, so if you're into barf, just check out the show. It's great. Anyway, Harold throws up, and then they're going to empty out some residential area, and they go through someone's entertainment room, I guess you could say, because there's Harold's partner is taking a bunch of movies because he wants to open a sort of like a movie. He wants to reopen a movie theater, basically. So he's stealing Blu-rays and stuff so he could do that. This is really interesting, though, is there's a Darkman poster in this house. And what's interesting about that, I've actually done a review on Darkman, so if you want to check that out on the channel, go ahead. It's a good movie. But anyway, so this reference is multiple layers. First of all, the villain of the series is Randall Flagg, also known as the Darkman. That's the first surface level reference. But even going one step further, Sam Raimi, the writer and director of Darkman, appeared in the original miniseries as a cameo. But even going another step, Stephen King, who wrote the novel this show is based on, got to see an early screening of The Evil Dead, Sam Raimi's very first movie, and he wrote a very positive review on that. People credit that as sort of the reason why Evil Dead was so popular at the time. Yeah, and so then Harold sees a magazine with Tom Cruise on it, and that becomes important later. And so I'm assuming he takes it. We don't see him take it, but he has the magazine later. So it's safe to assume that he has it. This is apparently Harold's first date, though it's not explicitly stated. So the kind of the foreman, the supervisor of the body removal unit, he says, if anybody wants to quit, just let me know so I can replace you. And like I said earlier, Harold is very respected in this new society, and so Harold raises his hand because he wants to stay. And so he kind of sets the precedent for that. Then we skip back 5 months earlier to the 4th of July. So that sets the present day, part 2, in about November or December. Okay, and except because if part 5 months earlier would be when the virus is kind of breaking out on the 4th of July, we hear on the radio it's the 4th of July. And so then that would put part 1 kind of June, July, August, and a little bit into September. That's part 1, and then part 2 would be September, November, December, and we haven't really touched anything on part 3 yet. So, but I would assume it's probably January to March. I'm not sure. Now this is the first introduction to Odessa Young's character, Franny Goldsmith. She is talking to her dad, and in the novel, this is not her first appearance. So her first appearance in the novel is like chapter 2, very early on. We meet her, and she finds out she's pregnant, so she talks to her boyfriend, and then right after that, in like chapter, I don't remember, but it's very early on in the novel, she goes and talks to her dad in the garden and tells him she's pregnant. And so this is kind of like that scene. But instead of telling him she's pregnant, he's sick, and so she's just like, I'll tell you later, and then they go inside. But I do think she's pregnant. It doesn't explicitly say in this episode if she's pregnant at this point in part 1. We do see in part 2 that when she's with Stu in the Boulder Free Zone, she is pregnant. But I don't, doesn't explicitly say, although I do think she is, based on sort of the imagery and just some subtle things that I'll get into later. But anyway, as we see, Harold is peeping at her through the fence, and then so some bullies, they stop him and they try to chase him, but he runs over a dead skunk and he has a wipeout. So yeah, he breaks his bike, the bullies leave him alone, and then we kind of go to this wide shot where he's on the pier walking, and there's just crowded everywhere, and we can hear the radio. This is one thing I don't like about this. We hear the radio, someone saying on the radio that the governor is considering banning all public gatherings in alignment with the CDC guidelines. This is just one line that you could have just taken out, because I don't want to hear about that. There's too much of that in real life. Just take it out. We don't need that line. But anyway, so Harold goes back to his house, and we meet his family. And it's kind of hinted at in the show, but in the novel it's very explicitly that his family doesn't like him. They're more into his sister, Amy. They're into his sister, Amy. His parents and his sister and everyone else doesn't really like him. And as we find out, Amy just had a bridal shower, which is contrasted with Fran in the novel, because Amy just had a bridal shower, but Franny conceived out of wedlock. So there's a bit of that tension with Fran's mom specifically in the novel. She doesn't appear to be in the show, although she might be. We might see her later on. And he gets a rejection letter from, I'm assuming, like some kind of magazine, because he writes stories, and so he got a rejection letter from one of the magazines he submitted to. And as we see, he nails him to the wall, and there's a whole bunch of them. So I'm assuming he's never been published. One thing I noticed, if you look really closely in the scene of Harold's bedroom, he has a poster for Eraserhead, which is like I think it was in the late 70s. It was a really like surreal experimental horror movie from like the late 70s. So I'm really surprised that they put that in. It's kind of a deep cut. Then we meet Stu Redman in the research facility in Texas. And so, right off the bat, I will say that his performance is a lot better than the other performance of Stu Redman in the 90s miniseries. People seem to really enjoy that, though I didn't. I think he only had one emotion. He was just angry all the time. It's not the way this character is portrayed in the novel or in the show. He's a lot more complex than that. But anyway, so we meet Stu, and he was, as we find out in Flashbacks, he was one of the first people to get in contact with this virus. And so the Dr. Ellis tells him that everyone else is dead except for him and a little girl. And one thing I will say is Dr. Ellis is, he dies at the end of this episode, but he's not in the novel. His character is actually really, really good. I like him a lot. Because a lot of times when you depict doctors in this sort of situation, they're very antagonistic or mean. But Dr. Ellis is just a nice guy who's just put in a bad situation. So I really enjoyed that. And then in the flashbacks we see, is it Charles Campion, I believe his name was, the guy from the testing facility. He carried the virus from Project Blue in California all the way to Arnett, Texas. And so we see him, and he's just like got snot all over his face, and his neck's all puffed out. It's really, really gross. I love the effects they did on this show. Apparently, the effects are done by Industrial Light and Magic, which is a subsidiary of Lucasfilms. I think that's in the credits, which is wild. Anyway. And so then, as Dr. Ellis leaves, the nurse that's testing on Stu starts coughing, and then it's like, oh, she's sick. And then we cut to, assuming a couple days later, the pier is completely empty except for a couple of dead bodies. And Harold's, did he fix his bike? Is he biking? I think he is. Harold's biking and looking for other survivors. And Fran is burying her dad. And then Harold finds her, and then he talks. He says, well, I guess you're used to loss because of your dead brother, which is just awful thing to say. But yeah, so in the novel, I'm going to keep going back to that because it's just, don't even worry about it. In the novel, it's said that Fran's mother, really favorite kid was the brother, I don't remember his name, and Fran's father's favorite child was Fran. And so when her brother died, she doesn't really remember her brother, but that really impacted her mom, and so she kind of closed off after that point. And so she's just really harsh and mean and doesn't really get along with anybody. And so this is a little hint towards that. I don't think we'll ever see the mom character in the show, but yeah. And then so they get talking, and Fran's like, well, the authorities will come in, and they'll take care of all the dead bodies. And Harold's like, no, the authorities are the ones that started this virus, and everyone is dead. And I think this is a good contrast between Fran's sort of optimistic characteristics and Harold's very conspiracy theories, and his very sour outlook on life, I guess you could say. Next part, we see a piece of cherry pie on the counter, and so this is, the camera keeps going back to this cherry pie, and so you're thinking, what's up with this? But in the novel, Fran goes nearly insane after losing her father and basically everybody. And so that and during that scene in the book, she's eating cherry pie, and so that's what this is alluding to. And also, there's this scene she's watching the TV when the power goes out, and the yeah, and in the novel, at this point she's not even mentally there anymore. She eventually recovers, but at this point she's awful. And she's watching as there are some rioters and looters that have hijacked a TV station, and they're basically just executing people on public television. And she's watching it like, wow, this is a really weird movie. But because she's just completely out of it and just removed from reality at that point. But in this, apparently she's watching the president give a speech. And now, I've heard that the president's voice, it never shows the president, but I've heard that his voice was a cameo. I can't place it. If you can, comment down below. I'd love to hear who that was. But then we see Harold, and he gets into a cop car, steals the cop's gun, and then he sees a typewriter, which is, obviously, it's the same typewriter from The Shining, same type of typewriter, obviously, because every Stephen King thing has to reference The Shining, because, obviously. And one thing, it's interesting because in the president's speech, he talks very openly about Captain Trips. There's a little bit of stuff he's kind of covering up, like, oh, it's not non-fatal, don't even worry about it. But in the book, the government completely denies that Captain Trips ever existed. Captain Trips is the virus. They completely deny this virus ever existed until the very end. And it's just wild because they're murdering reporters who try to report on it. They have they hold news stations hostage. They will not let anybody leave their town because they're all under forced quarantine, or they won't have anyone talk about this virus because they just want to cover everything up and they'll kill anybody who talks about it. And so that part in the book, that is about halfway through the first part. That part is just very intense and I really enjoy it. So right after the power goes out, Franny has a corn maze dream, and this is the first, not corn maze, cornfield. Yeah. I don't know. This is the first time we see Mother Abigail in the show, played by Whoopi Goldberg. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I'll have to see more of her in the future to know for sure. One thing that's really interesting is we hear children's laughter and we see a kid actually runs with the corn. So my theory is that this is either a young Mother Abigail or this is Franny's kid. Because a large part of her story in the novel is her trying to take care of this kid. And a lot of the dreams she has, both from Mother Abigail and the Darkmen, revolve around babies and children. So that's either Franny's child or Mother Abigail as a child, because there's actually a couple chapters in the book that focus on sort of her Mother Abigail's backstory. So this could be a reference to that, I'm not sure. Then we meet Mother Abigail, telling her to come to Colorado, which is interesting because at first in the novel they all go to Nevada and then migrate to Colorado as their group gets bigger and bigger. But apparently this time they're just going straight to Colorado. Harold, he has some maps and he's planning his route to go to the CDC headquarters, I believe, in Atlanta, Georgia. And so probably on the way down there they will run into Stu Redman and hopefully at some point Glenn Bateman, although we haven't been introduced to his character yet. And then we cut back to Stu at the at the research facility. They are moving to the CDC in Stovington, Vermont, which is very near to Maine, where Franny and Harold are right now. We meet Dr. Cobb, who says he's a doctor, but he's probably just like a bodyguard of some kind. I have more thoughts on him I'll get to in a minute. And then we cut to back to Harold, who's brushing his teeth, and he's listening to the same radio host he was earlier. And he said, the radio guy's like, oh, I'm not going to let Captain Trips get to me, so he kills himself on air. Which is kind of what happens. We get alluded to this in the original miniseries, but in the book, I believe there was a radio host that he's trying to talk about Captain Trips, but then he gets killed by the U.S. government. Maybe that was just in the original miniseries. It might not be in the book. I don't remember. and he starts trying to talk himself in the mirror, similar to what the Huntress does in Birds of Prey, although in Birds of Prey this was funny and this is kind of scary. Yeah, so they go to Vermont, and Stu's sort of room where they're keeping is actually really nice. Apparently it belonged to the vice president of the CDC. I don't know why he has a room at the headquarters, but it's a really nice room. There's like a wall that changes scenery. Very cool place. Then we cut back to Harold and Fran. So he's made all of his plans. He's already packed, and so he's going to look for Fran to tell her that they're leaving to go to Georgia. But as he stumbles upon her, she's trying to kill herself via overdose, but he makes her throw up by sticking his fingers down her throat. And that's the third time that someone threw up. I believe the second time was when they discovered Campion. I don't remember. Now, they start talking about when 5 years ago, and he says he was a child. So I'm assuming present day he's 16. 5 years ago he would have been 11. So she says that while she was babysitting him, so she's probably 21, she nailed his first rejection letter to the wall. And since then he's put all the other rejection letters on top of that nail in the wall. So yeah, the age difference looks to be about 5 years, 16, 21, yeah. And so Harold's like, we're the only survivors in here, in our town of Ogunquit, and so likely that means that the disease is 99% deadly, kills 99.5, I believe, maybe it's 4, I'm not sure, percent of everybody he comes in contact with. And then so Fran says, she interrupts him and says, so that means we're the future. And I believe that this line is alluding to her being pregnant. The show just hasn't revealed that yet. But anyway, now we cut to Stu's dream, and this is a little bit different. He goes to the corn, but he doesn't see Mother Abigail. He hears a baby crying, which is, I don't know what that means. But then he sees the Dark Man's wolf. So, I'm not sure what that means, but it'll be interesting to see where they go with that. Next, so Dr. Ellis wakes Stu up. He's not quite sick to the point where his neck is bulging, but he is very snotty. And so he has a scalpel and he wants to kill himself, but then Cobb comes in and shoots him. Now Cobb is really late in the game. He's just snot all over his face. At first I thought it was facial hair, but it's just snot, and his neck's all bulging out. And then Stu takes the scalpel and slices it, and just all the snot and phlegm just, it's gross. And then, so after that, we see on the cameras that he's being watched by General Starkey. And so in this, it looks like Starkey is head of the CDC, but in the novel, he was head of Project Blue, which was the project that developed Captain Trips. And so he ends up killing himself out of guilt in the novel. Similar situation in the TV show. Dr. Cobb was not under his orders, so it's sort of ambiguous as to who Cobb was working for. I believe he was working for the Dark Man as kind of an inside man, but we'll have to see. Starkey mentions his daughter gave him a poetry book, and he quotes The Second Coming, which is a poem about Revelation and World War I. And so this next part's interesting. Harold and Franny, they spray paint on the wall that they're leaving Ogunquit September 14th, which is 2 months and 10 days after July the 4th, which is interesting because what happened in those 2 months, I don't know. And then we cut back to Boulder. We see Harold is rescuing a guy, and he's really getting along with people there. He rescues someone from falling into a pit of dead bodies. He talks to his friend about building the movie theater. And it's kind of, all while this is happening, this happy stuff, it's sort of contrasting with his monologue about how he wants to kill them all. It's really great. One of the characters calls him Hawk, which is his nickname because he's well respected in the society. He has a dream about the Dark Man, who offers him a black stone and tells him to go to Vegas. And then we cut back to him looking in the mirror, and he has Tom Cruise cut out on the mirror, and he's trying to mimic that. One thing I really enjoy is while he's walking through crowded Boulder, he's smiling to everybody, but when everyone looks away, he frowns again. It's great. He runs into Fran and Stu, and they invite him to dinner, and he's obviously very not happy about that, and so he says he wants to kill them. He doesn't say it to their face, obviously, because he's just happy he's wearing a mask, which is interesting because Billy Joel's Stranger, which is a song about wearing masks, is playing in the background. So it's really, on a side note, a lot of the music they play is just, wow, it's so good, so good. And then it's interesting because one of the last scenes, I think it's actually the last scene of this episode is actually the first scene, both in the novel and the original miniseries. It's Charles Campion after they have sort of something goes wrong in Project Blue testing facility in California, and so instead of staying there and locking down, he takes the virus and he runs with his family, and they drive away. But what's interesting here is that one of the doors gets stuck, and we see that it's being held open by a foot, probably the Dark Man's foot, but he can't. Campion doesn't see that. Another interesting thing, I really like this, is we see the Dark Man on the road, and in the novel and in the original miniseries, the introduction to the Dark Man was on the road, but albeit at a different point in the story. And then so he's hitchhiking on the road, they drive right past him, and then Campion looks in the rear view mirror, and he sees the Dark Man hugging his child, Campion's child. So that's really creepy. All around, it's good stuff. I'm a little concerned about the ramifications of the nonlinear storytelling. I'm interested to see where they go with that. But yeah, all in all, great acting, good show. I'm really excited for next week. And make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out on that or any of our other reviews. You can check us out on Facebook if you want to join this conversation. We talk a lot about nerdy stuff there. There's a whole community. It's great. If you're interested in news and commentary, you can follow us on Instagram, or if you want to contact the show directly, you can do so on Twitter. And if you want to contribute, Patreon. All the links are going to be in the description below. Until then, thanks for watching. I will see you next time.